I did say I was going to try and keep this series up to date with new ship additions, so here it is. The review of the only Japanese naval addition to update direct hit, Aoba. She sits at 5.7 and some of you may have already noticed a striking resemblance to Furutaka. So does that make Aoba equal to her? Well, let's find out. When we look at Aoba's main armament, we see an identical loadout to Furutaka with 6 203mm guns in 3 dual mounts. 2 at the front in a super firing pair and 1 mount at the rear. These guns are identical to all other Japanese late heavy cruisers with a reload varying between 15.6 to 12 seconds, with the only noticeable difference being the mounts themselves. Instead of being the boxy turrets we're familiar with, they're a more rounded design. They still have the same armor protection, so it's not really that noteworthy, other than that it looks different. The 203mm guns still carry the same ammo as on the other Japanese heavy cruisers, namely high explosive, armor piercing and high explosive time fuse. High explosive is useful against smaller targets or when you want to knock out poorly protected gun mounts. Armor piercing is the shell of choice for knocking out engines and detonating ammo. There are very few cruisers that can reliably resist these shells, but there are no miracle shells, just keep it in mind. The last shell, high explosive time fuse, is an anti-air shell but rather unreliable, especially with the poor gun traverse on Aoba's main guns. You could take a few salvos worth, but don't be surprised if they don't even hit an enemy aircraft. One thing of note as well is that the firing arc of the rear turret looks really good, but in reality the rear gun can only be fired past this little post. Any more forward than it and the guns get pushed up to a range I don't quite know, but let's say it's simply that that range is too far for most engagements. When it comes to Aoba's secondary armament, we are again reminded of the Furutaka, with Aoba having the same 120mm guns in 4 single mounts. They pretty much serve the same role as in the Furutaka class too, having the choice between high explosive and high explosive time fuse shells. I personally prefer using these guns as long-range anti-air by equipping nothing but the time fuse shells. They're not the best in this role, but there really isn't anything else they're more suitable for, as at this BR there aren't any suitable surface targets to engage with them. When it comes to her small caliber guns, Aoba follows the same trend as late war Japanese ships, and is thus riddled with 25mm guns, 50 in total. These are in 5 triple mounts, 10 dual mounts and 15 single mounts. And again, common with the late war Japanese cruisers, these are decent but only for self-defense, and even then they can fail you, especially if you don't have the anti-air armament targeting modification unlocked. That has gotten me killed on several occasions. Another flaw of this kind of anti-air suite, and a flaw that haunts all Japanese ships in general, is the lack of any decent medium-range guns. The 25s can often just be too late to really defend you. A benefit of this large array of 25mm guns, however, is that it will adequately protect you from sneaky coastal vessels, though I highly recommend you deal with them yourself, as AI gunners aren't exactly known for their accuracy against ships. And as should be expected whenever you look at a Japanese cruiser, there are of course torpedoes involved. These are identical to Furutaka and a lot of Japanese cruisers, having a payload of 627.2 kg of TNT equivalent, a range of 20 km and a speed of 91 km an hour. If you've seen my previous video on the Japanese cruisers, you should be well familiar with these torpedoes. On Aoba they come in 2 quadruple launchers, both having a full reload. The major difference between Aoba and Furutaka here are the firing arcs of these torpedoes. Aoba can only really fire these in the rearward arc, making them somewhat less versatile. Most certainly still useful, but more restricted. Up next, mobility. Aoba is nothing special, but I personally found her to be rather sluggish when stock. Her top speed varies between 53 and 62 km an hour, depending on the modifications you've unlocked, which isn't particularly bad, but not speedy either. Her turning radius isn't anything special either, but what really stood out to me when it comes to Aoba's mobility is just how much speed she loses in a turn. It's especially painful when stock, but luckily becomes manageable when fully upgraded, but still something of note. Survivability wise, we see even more similarities with Furutaka. As a matter of fact, it is identical. So much so that making this graphic is almost redundant, but here we go. The gun mounts are still notoriously vulnerable, as is the norm for pretty much all Japanese cruisers. The magazines are far enough below the waterline that getting detonated is pretty rare. They're also covered by some armored decks and bulkheads, which always helps. The engines have a moderate amount of protection, which won't stop most shells from ships of equal BR, but it proves an alright protection when heavily angled. The torpedo protection can absorb up to 250 kg of TNT from any source, so yes, torpedo protection can be knocked out by shell fire, so see it as a temporary armor layer. The fuel tanks don't provide any kind of useful protection, so they can be ignored. The only other protection of note are the protection on the bridge and the gun shields from the secondary turrets. Not good enough to effectively stop shell fire, but will resist some small caliber autocannon fire. While all of this is perhaps not that impressive, I found Aoba to be rather resilient, and can take quite a beating before going down. Of course, that's when being fired upon by cruisers, but still. So what's the playstyle of Aoba? Well, here I'd argue we do see a difference with Furitaka. Furitaka wasn't really capable of going down flanks alone, especially if those were restricted in space. Aoba, with her enhanced anti-air, is very well capable of defending herself when going on lone expeditions, whether it's from aircraft or coastal water vessels. If this is not possible or isn't quite up your alley, then stick at range. Use your torpedoes, and using your good firing arc, stay heavily angled. Aoba isn't the most powerful ship, so much so that I actually prefer Furitaka when fighting other cruisers, but I find Aoba to be much more versatile and adaptable to whatever map you may encounter. Especially thanks to her radar, which I hadn't mentioned previously. Though I do actually find this radar screen to be rather annoying, but that's besides the point. She can become a great asset when playing in a squad to pick up aerial threats early. All in all, Aoba is incredibly similar to Furitaka in appearances and statistics, but when it comes to playstyle I believe she is much more well-rounded. Pros: alright anti-air capabilities, potent torpedoes, decent survivability. Cons: restricted firing arcs, low number of main caliber guns, sluggish when stock. Verdict: consider it. I haven't really had the chance to test her properly after the BR changes, but Aoba isn't exactly the best of the best. I still managed to enjoy her and managed to get this result with her just after spading her. If you're a fan of Furitaka, then you'll certainly appreciate the subtle and not so subtle differences between her and Aoba. I find Aoba to be a fine addition to the Japanese tech tree and hope to see more Japanese cruisers added. They still got a fair few interesting ones. I realized that my video uploading has slowed down a bit, but I still have more than enough videos planned. I just need to find the time to make them. So, I hope to see you again in this series' next update. Goodbye, and may the seas be calm.